Hello students, this is Miss Gilsdorf, and I'm here to give you an overview on ecology and evolution. So first, let's talk a little bit about the carbon cycle. So it starts with photosynthesis. So this is where carbon is first entering the system through carbon dioxide. Through cellular respiration, we're releasing carbon dioxide again. Remember, that's a byproduct. Also through decomposition, we're getting carbon dioxide released back into the air, which can then, of course, be taken up by a plant and then reincorporated into a biological molecule like a sugar, so that's our glucose. So climate change, how does this all connect to climate change in the carbon cycle? If you're releasing more of this carbon through carbon dioxide than is what is captured by plants or buried through soils or dissolved in the ocean, then you're going to have an enhanced greenhouse effect because there's going to be more carbon dioxide in the air. You also have, through the decomposition and burial of this carbon, can be eventually incorporated into fossil fuels. So if we're burning more of these fossil fuels than is being buried, then you're also going to get increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that way. For the nitrogen cycle, some important points to note. How nitrogen enters the nitrogen cycle into the biological nitrogen cycle is through nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So these bacteria live in the water, soil, or are present in nodules in the roots of certain plants like legumes. So they're incorporating the atmospheric nitrogen into biological molecules. And that's really important for us because, as you know, nitrogen is a component of proteins and DNA. Some factors affecting climate are greenhouse effect. So back to the carbon cycle, if we're burning fossil fuels, we're releasing a lot of carbon dioxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas. So it's increasing warming of our planet as the sun's energy is coming in and is not being allowed to come out. It's this insulating effect that we have. Other environmental processes that can affect climate. Volcanic eruptions, that's going to release a lot of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases like methane. Erosion, where you get some chemical weathering. So we're breaking down rocks. We are exposing some of these rocks to the atmosphere through increased rain from higher sea levels. It's going to affect what the land looks like, and that's going to affect what the climate is in that area. Our energy pyramid. So in general, we're talking about the energy pyramid. We're talking about how energy moves through the living system. And in general, this is about 10% efficiency. So if we're going from our producers at the bottom here, which would, of course, be the plants, that's where the energy is first entering that system, you're going to have about 90% energy loss from that to the next one. So it's only about 10% of that original energy is moving to the next step of that pyramid. So where does that energy go? About 90% of that energy transformed is transformed into heat. So this is our metabolic processes. This is what our living animals and plants, a byproduct of their metabolism. So starting with the sun, producers are capturing that energy. Producers are eaten by our primary consumers to obtain that energy, and so on and so forth. So it's going to require continual input of energy from the sun for this whole energy pyramid to work and keep energy in the living system. Some organisms' adaptations for the environment. So really what adaptations are to increase an organism's survival rate based on what their environment is. So they're trying to adapt to the outside world the best they can so they can survive and reproduce. So this is where survival and reproductive success. Some adaptations that organisms have are behavioral adaptations. So this could be suckling, taxis, which is movement based on stimulation or a stimulus around them. So that could be these moths are moving towards the light. They're responding to that light stimulus. Migration, estivation, which is a dormancy of an animal. They'll lower their metabolic rate during hot or dry periods, so you might see this in some snakes or lizards as they're conserving their energy. Habituation, getting used to things in your environment, imprinting, classical conditioning, and trial and error. These are all behavioral adaptations that organisms exhibit so they can best adapt and survive in their environment. We also have structural adaptations. So just like it sounds, these are structures that animals have to help it survive wherever it lives. So this could be in terms of nutrition, how they get their food, respiration, the type of respiration that they do, how they transport nutrients throughout their bodies, how they're excreting wastes. They might have camouflage. So here there's a moth. It has a structural adaptation. It has that patterning on its wings so it can blend in with the bark and not be seen by predators. Of course, movement, how that animal gets around and navigates their environment is related to its structure, what it's shaped like. We also have reproductive adaptations. So how does that organism reproduce? Does it do sexual reproduction? Is it an asexual organism, like a bacteria? Does it lay eggs? Does it produce seeds? What type of spores does it have? Is it a placental animal, like a human? Different types of fertilization. Is it internal fertilization versus external fertilization? Like salmon undergo the external fertilization. So this really determines how many offspring are being produced, how often are animals reproducing, is an adaptation for reproduction. I'm going to talk about some symbiotic relationships that organisms have. Mutualism. So this is an example of a symbiotic relationship where both organisms are going to benefit. So what comes to mind first with me is an oxpecker, which is a type of bird. And the oxpeckers like to sit on the rhinoceros. And what they're doing is they're picking off little parasites like ticks off of the rhinoceros. So the oxpecker, the bird, benefits from this because they get a meal. They get to eat the ticks off of this rhinoceros. And the rhinoceros is benefiting because they're getting ticks pulled off of them. So they're getting rid of these parasites. Parasitism, so that would be the tick itself. It's benefiting because it's getting a meal off of that rhinoceros or whatever animal it's attached to. But of course, that animal that has the ticks attached to it has a negative relationship to it because it's getting its blood sucked out. It could also get diseases from that parasite. Different forms of communication between organisms. So these are how organisms send messages to one another. So you might have courtship dances, which could communicate reproductive fitness between animals. So different birds will have really complex courtship dances that communicate, I'm the fittest bird and you want to reproduce with me. If they're organisms that are territorial, they're claiming an area and its resources because it wants those resources for itself. It doesn't want to share them with any other creature. Pheromones, so these are chemical messengers, often through smell or olfactory sense. Bees will communicate with one another through pheromones, different signals, whether it's food or movement. Your predator-prey relationships. Of course, one animal or organism is going to prey upon the other for food. So in response to that, they need to be adapted to either evade or capture that prey. You have competition between organisms, so either of the same species or different species. If they're going after the same resource, then they're going to have adaptations to outcompete one another because they want those resources, because if they have the resources, then they're going to be able to live, and if they're going to be able to live, they're going to be able to reproduce, and their genes are going to persist. So ecosystems, stable over time. So there's a presence of a limiting factor, so our food, how much food is available, what type of climate it is it a pretty stable climate, or is it a climate that's going to change rapidly? How much water is available, the territory, so the size of this area, is going to prevent exponential growth of any one species. It's going to keep it in balance. So some factors that are affecting population growth. So our birth and our death rates. If there's more births and deaths, then our population is going to increase. And vice versa, if there's a higher death rate than there is a birth rate, then our population is going to decrease. It's going to affect our population size. So our overall population size, how many individuals of this population are you starting with? The density, so how close together are these organisms, which could affect how they're using their resources. And the available resources. Is there abundant food? Is there only a little bit of food? Things that these organisms need to survive. Disease, of course, can disrupt an ecosystem balance. So like AIDS and influenza, tuberculosis, which is what the TB stands for in humans, Dutch elm disease in trees, can affect populations because you're essentially removing any of these individuals that aren't adapted to fight the disease or that die as a result of the disease influence. So some human impact in the environments. We are probably the quintessential creatures on the planet that modify everything. We are the kings and queens of modifying the environment. So for humans, population growth. There's lots of us. If there's lots of us, we're going to be modifying the environment all around us. Our pollution, so our byproduct of how we live, whether it's garbage or pesticides or burning over fossil fuels. We're all putting these things out into the environment. Of course, through the burning of fossil fuels, we have the concern of global warming. We're warming our planet because we have disrupted this carbon cycle. We're putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than can be incorporated into plants or buried in soils and rocks. We're destroying habitat. So we're taking habitat away from populations of organisms that need it. They can't survive and reproduce if they don't have a place to do it. Our introduction of non-native species. So a great example of that would be the kudzu vine, which can choke out native plants, which might be important to food source for native animals. So that's where conservation and preservation and conservation are going to be important here. Being cognizant of our population growth and the associated pollution, global warming that can go along with that, and really putting forth efforts to either curb our usage or modify how we affect the environment is going to be really important here. So some examples of North Carolina in particular, acid rain, so how our emissions from our cars are affecting the rain and the acidity, so the pH of the rain. Beach erosion, so if we're wanting to preserve oceanfront land, we might put jetties in, but that's going to affect how the shape of the beach is, and it could actually cause some pretty devastating consequences to organisms that live in those bays and those estuarian areas, so near the ocean. Urban development. So if we're taking away natural spaces, then we're fragmenting a lot of where these organisms live. Waste lagoons. So there's a lot of people, we're going to be producing a lot of waste, which could affect our water, our runoff from farming, which can upset the balance that we have in our waterways. And of course, again, the example of kudzu. Our effects of our natural resources. So we're depleting the resources that we have. We have deforestation, so we're cutting down a lot of that habitat. We're using pesticides, and then bioaccumulation of those pesticides within the living system.